In every neighborhood, there is always someone who believes they own not only their own house, but every house around them as well. In my case, that person was Karen Wellington, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association. She wasn't technically the president, though she carried herself as if the entire board existed only to serve her opinions. And her opinions, unfortunately, often became rules. When I first moved into Lakeshore Estates, I thought I had found a quiet refuge. The cul-de-sacs were lined with identical trimmed hedges, the houses sat in orderly rows, and the driveways gleamed with regulation-approved concrete. The community brochure bragged about uniform beauty and visual harmony, phrases that sounded impressive but carried a sinister undertone I didn't understand until later. My house wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. A modest two-story with a wraparound porch that had seen better days. I had bought it in foreclosure, fixed the roof with my own two hands, and scrubbed years of grime from its wooden bones. When the time came to repaint, I didn't want beige, gray, or any of the soulless shades that lined the neighborhood. I wanted something cheerful, something alive, something that reflected the laughter my daughter and I had shared on that porch. The memories of spilled lemonade, late-night stories, and the quiet courage it took to rebuild a life after everything else had crumbled. So, I painted it a soft sky blue. Not neon, not blinding, just a warm, calming blue that glowed in the morning sun. To me, it was perfect. To Karen, it was heresy. The notice came within 3 days. A letter slipped into my mailbox, typed in bold font and sealed with the HOA's stamp of authority. It declared that my unapproved paint color violated Section 4, Paragraph C of the Neighborhood Covenant. It stated in cold legal language that my house must be repainted, in an acceptable shade approved by the board. The list of acceptable shades was attached: beige, taupe, light gray, off-white, and an alarming number of variations of sand. It was clear. My house was too bright, too different, too alive. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just a formality, the kind of letter meant to scare but never enforced. But then came the fines. $50 the first week, $100 the next. And by the end of the month, the penalties ballooned into a number I couldn't possibly pay without draining what little savings I had left. Neighbors began to whisper. Some shook their heads as they walked by, pretending they didn't see me on the porch. Others glanced nervously at the house, as if my blue siding might infect theirs. Only a handful dared to smile, and even they looked over their shoulders before doing so, as though kindness itself was punishable under Karen's watchful eye. The HOA's next letter was sharper, dripping with threat. If I didn't comply within 30 days, they would take legal action to enforce compliance. My house, my sanctuary, was suddenly at risk because it didn't blend into the endless sea of beige. At night, I would sit on the porch, staring at the soft blue walls, and wonder how something so harmless could spark such venom. The house looked beautiful. Children walking home from school pointed at it with delight. Even delivery drivers seemed to slow down, smiling at the color. It wasn't offensive, it was joyful. But to Karen and her allies, it was rebellion. I considered repainting, I'll admit. When you're threatened with losing your home, pride feels like a luxury. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about paint. It was about control. About one person dictating the lives of everyone around her, squeezing the individuality out of us until we were all copies of each there. If I gave in, I wouldn't just be repainting my house. I would be surrendering to a system that thrived on fear. And so, as the deadline loomed closer, I began to look for loopholes. I spent nights scrolling through the HOA bylaws, my eyes burning as I traced every clause, every footnote, every vague phrase that could be twisted. I found nothing at first, just pages upon pages of suffocating rules about lawn height, trash bin placement, and even the types of curtains deemed acceptable for street-facing windows. But then, buried deep in Section 7, I found a line that caught my attention. It stated that houses must be painted in uniform, solid colors deemed acceptable by the board. That word, solid, stuck in my mind like a thorn. What if the house wasn't one solid color? What if it was many? A plan began to form. A wild, reckless plan that would either destroy me completely or free me from Karen's chokehold forever. As the 30-day deadline approached, I purchased buckets of paint: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, and every shade in between. The cashier raised an eyebrow, but I only smiled, imagining Karen's face when she saw what I had in store. The HOA wanted beige. They wanted conformity. They wanted me silent and obedient. Instead, I would give them a spectacle. The night before the deadline, I stood in my driveway, the cans of paint lined up like soldiers ready for battle. My house glowed faintly in the streetlight, still sky blue, still beautiful, but about to be transformed into something far greater. My heart pounded with fear and exhilaration. I wasn't just repainting my house. I was declaring war. And when the sun rose the next morning, Lakeshore Estates would never look the same again. The morning of the deadline arrived with a golden sunrise stretching across the cul-de-sac, spilling light onto identical beige homes that glistened with dew. For a moment, everything was quiet, orderly, and exactly how Karen liked it. But that fragile uniformity was about to be shattered. By the time the neighborhood began to stir, the transformation was complete. My once soft blue home now blazed with every color imaginable. The siding was striped in bold red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, each hue carefully painted in sharp, deliberate bands. The shutters had been splashed with alternating shades, the trim edged in bright contrast. The porch posts stood tall like candy canes, spiraled with playful twists of color. Even the mailbox had been reborn, a miniature rainbow beacon at the curb. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't haphazard. It was art. Every stroke had been intentional, every line sharp, every panel glowing under the morning sun like stained glass come to life. My house didn't just stand out. It sang. The first reaction came from the joggers. Two women who passed by daily slowed to a stop, staring with wide eyes. Their mouths opened, then closed, then opened again, as if words had abandoned them. One pulled out her phone, snapping photos, while the other whispered something before breaking into quiet laughter. Then came the children, backpacks bouncing as they walked to school. Their squeals pierced the air as they pointed, tugging on their parents' arms. Some clapped, some jumped up and down. A little girl danced in the driveway as if the house itself had filled her with joy. But not everyone was delighted. From across the street, blinds twitched open. Faces appeared in the shadows, watching, frowning, muttering. And then, like a storm cloud rolling in, Karen herself emerged. Her steps were sharp, her heels clicking against the sidewalk as she marched toward my lawn. She froze at the curb, staring at the rainbow house with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Her face flushed red, the kind of red that came not from embarrassment, but from pure, unfiltered rage. Within an hour, the HOA board had gathered. 3 of the M stood in front of my house, clipboards in hand, pretending to take notes, but mostly just gawking. One whispered to another, shaking his head as though the sight alone gave him vertigo. Karen spoke in quick, angry bursts, stabbing her finger toward the house, toward me, toward the rows of horrified beige homes behind her. I didn't step outside. I didn't need to. The house spoke for me. By midday, photos of the rainbow house had spread across social media. A teenager posted a video of it on TikTok, overlaying it with a caption that read, "This guy said no to the HOA." Within hours, the clip went viral. People began to drive through Lakeshore Estates just to see it. Cars slowed down, passengers leaning out windows to snap pictures, some even pulling over to take selfies with the rainbow backdrop. The HOA tried to contain it. A second letter arrived in my mailbox, this one stamped urgent. It demanded immediate compliance, accusing me of mocking the rules and threatening serious legal consequences. But the letter, for all its severity, revealed their weakness. They could cite the requirement for solid colors, but nowhere did it say I couldn't use multiple. The rainbow wasn't one color, it was many. And that single loophole was my shield. Karen, of course, refused to accept defeat. She spent the afternoon going door to door, rallying the neighbors, waving petitions in the air, warning them that my rainbow home would devalue the community. Some signed, fearful of her wrath. Others hesitated, murmuring that the house was actually nice. One elderly man shrugged, telling her it was the most exciting thing to happen in the neighborhood in decades. The battle lines had been drawn. On one side stood Karen, wielding the HOA's rulebook like a weapon. On the other stood me, armed with a rainbow fortress that had already captured the hearts of strangers outside our gates. By evening, local news vans had arrived. Reporters stood on the curb, microphones in hand, narrating the colorful controversy brewing in Lakeshore Estates. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing sweeping shots of the rainbow house glowing against its beige backdrop. The footage was impossible to ignore. My home, once an ordinary structure, had become a symbol. Some called it rebellion, some called it art, some called it madness. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was unforgettable. Karen's fury reached a fever pitch that night. She called an emergency HOA meeting in the community clubhouse, demanding every resident attend. The parking lot overflowed with cars, the air thick with tension as neighbors filed inside, their voices rising in debate. Though I stayed home, I could hear the echoes from across the street. Angry shouts, bursts of applause, the clash of opinions colliding like storm waves. Some demanded my punishment. Others defended me, arguing that the HOA had no right to crush individuality. For the first time, Karen's iron grip seemed to falter. When the meeting ended, people spilled into the night, their faces flushed from argument. Some avoided my house entirely. Others lingered on the sidewalk, whispering, staring up at the rainbow glow under the porch light. I sat in my living room, listening to the distant hum of voices, knowing the war had only just begun. The HOA wouldn't stop. Karen wouldn't stop. They would come at me with every tool, every fine, every lawyer they could muster. But now, the battlefield had shifted. It was no longer just my fight. The world was watching. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of something far larger than I had ever imagined. The days following the unveiling of the rainbow house felt unreal. What began as a neighborhood squabble had spiraled into something that neither I nor the HOA could control. The rainbow walls, so vivid and defiant, had turned into a beacon that drew people from miles away. By the third day, the street in front of my home was lined with cars. Families arrived with children in strollers, teenagers posed dramatically for selfies, and older couples strolled hand in hand, laughing as though they'd stumbled into some secret art installation hidden in the suburbs. Local food trucks even began to appear, parking nearby to take advantage of the crowds. What had once been a sleepy cul-de-sac was now a destination. The HOA, of course, saw none of this as charming. To them, it was chaos, an invasion. Karen stormed the sidewalks with a clipboard in one hand and a cell phone in the other, barking into it as she snapped photos of the growing crowds. She called the police more than once, claiming disturbances and trespassing, but each time officers arrived, they found nothing but happy visitors admiring a house that technically broke no law. But the HOA wasn't about to let technicalities stop them. Within a week, I received the thickest envelope yet, 50 pages of legal threats, citations, and notices of intent. They accused me of violating community standards, disrupting peace, creating safety hazards, and even damaging property values. Each page dripped with Karen's fury, sharpened into legalese by the HOA's attorneys. I read every word carefully. The more I read, the more I realized they were bluffing. Their claims were broad, vague, and desperate. They didn't have a rule against multiple colors, and they knew it. What they did have was money, lawyers, and the stubbornness of Karen, who had declared war on my rainbow fortress and would stop at nothing to see it dismantled. The community itself was split. On one hand, there were those who clung to conformity, fearful that my rebellion might one day devalue their carefully polished beige homes. On the other, there were neighbors who saw the house as a breath of fresh air, a challenge to the suffocating sameness they had quietly endured for years. The debates spilled into sidewalks, driveways, and even grocery store aisles. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone, too, gay aside. Meanwhile, the Rainbow House's fame only grew. Local artists stopped by, sketching and painting their own renditions. Bloggers wrote think pieces about suburban conformity versus individuality. A travel vlogger declared it the happiest house in America in a video that racked up millions of views. Each new spotlight made Karen's fury boil hotter. She launched a counteroffensive. Signs appeared at the neighborhood entrance, warning visitors they were trespassing. The HOA began towing cars parked along the street, sparking angry confrontations with tourists who had come just to snap a picture. Karen even tried to plant hedges at the cul-de-sac entrance to block the view of my house, though the city quickly ordered them removed. But her most aggressive move came in the form of a lawsuit. One crisp morning, a process server knocked on my door and handed me the papers. The HOA was suing me for non-compliance, seeking not only fines, but also the right to forcibly repaint my house. The demand was clear: return it to beige or lose it altogether. The weight of the lawsuit pressed down on me. For all my bravado, I was just one homeowner. I didn't have a legal team or deep pockets. Every spare dollar I had went into maintaining the house, and now I faced the possibility of losing it entirely. Karen knew this. The HOA knew this. Their strategy wasn't just about winning, it was about crushing me under financial ruin until I surrendered. But then something unexpected happened. The very people who had flocked to admire the house began to rally. A GoFundMe appeared online, started by someone I'd never met, titled Save the Rainbow House. Within hours, donations poured in. Comments flooded the page, people declaring that the Rainbow House was more than paint. It was a symbol of standing up against oppressive rules. Strangers across the country were sending money, encore, agement, and solidarity. The lawsuit, which was meant to isolate me, had backfired. Instead of a private battle between me and the HOA, it had become a public war, one that Karen couldn't control. Reporters crowded the steps of the courthouse during hearings. Protesters gathered outside HOA meetings, waving signs that read, "Let the rainbow shine." Through it all, Karen doubled down. She delivered fiery speeches about protecting property values and preserving community integrity. But the more she fought, the more she looked less like a protector and more like a tyrant. Her reputation, once untouchable within the HOA, began to crack. Even her closest allies hesitated, glancing nervously at the growing tide of public opinion. Inside my rainbow house, I lived in a whirlwind. Some nights, I lay awake, overwhelmed by the attention, the noise, the uncertainty. But each morning, when the sunlight struck the bands of color across my porch, I felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told to shrink themselves, to blend in, to surrender their uniqueness for the sake of conformity. The HOA wanted beige. They wanted silence. They wanted control. But what they had instead was a rainbow that refused to fade. And as the first court hearing loomed on the calendar, the battle for the future of Lakeshore Estates and for the meaning of individuality itself was about to reach its most critical stage yet. The courthouse steps had never seen so much color. On the morning of the first hearing, the street outside was flooded with people waving rainbow flags, holding homemade signs, and chanting slogans that turned my quiet neighborhood squabble into a national spectacle. Cameras lined the sidewalks, reporters jostled for sound bites, and news vans circled like vultures eager to capture every angle. In the middle of it all stood Karen Wellington, dressed in beige from head to toe, her face tight with fury. She clutched a binder thick with documents, her lips pursed as if the chants around her were poison in the air. To her, this wasn't a protest. It was an ambush. But to the crowd, she was the villain, the woman trying to strangle joy with rules. Inside the courtroom, the tension was no less electric. The HOA's lawyers sat stiffly at their table, surrounded by folders of evidence, photos of my rainbow house, and highlighted passages from the bylaws. Their argument was simple. I had violated community standards by refusing to use an approved color, and therefore, I must repaint. My side of the courtroom was humbler. A small team of volunteer attorneys, strangers who had offered their services after the GoFundMe went viral, sat beside me, flipping through the same bylaws that the HOA clung to. They were sharp, determined, and motivated not by money, but by principle. The hearing began, and the HOA's attorneys wasted no time painting me as reckless. They described the Rainbow House as a nuisance, a circus attraction that disrupted the peace and endangered property values. They claimed visitors blocked driveways, created hazards, and frightened residents who simply wanted quiet uniformity. Their words dripped with disdain, each sentence carefully designed to make my home sound less like a house and more like an invading carnival. But then came my defense. My attorneys highlighted the very line I had found in the bylaws. Houses must be painted in a solid color approved by the board. They pointed out, with deliberate emphasis, that nowhere did it state a house couldn't have multiple solid colors. The rainbow, they argued, was not against the rules. It simply wasn't anticipated by them. The judge listened, expression unreadable, while reporters scribbled notes and cameras flashed from the gallery. The tension grew thicker with every exchange. When Karen was called to testify, she delivered her performance with all the indignation of a monarcha, but decrying rebellion. She spoke of order, of tradition, of property values plummeting under the weight of my rainbow spectacle. But under cross-examination, her cracks began to show. When asked for evidence of falling property values, she had none. When asked whether the bylaws explicitly banned multiple colors, she hesitated, then admitted they did not. Each admission sent murmurs rippling through the courtroom, reporters scribbling faster, cameras catching every twitch of her frown. The hearing ended without a ruling, the judge declaring he needed time to review the arguments. But in truth, the ruling had already been made in the court of public opinion. Outside, the crowd roared as I exited the courthouse, chanting my name as if I were some unlikely folk hero. The Rainbow House wasn't just paint anymore. It had become a symbol of defiance against control, a banner for individuality in a sea of beige conformity. The HOA, however, refused to accept defeat. Karen doubled her efforts, calling emergency board meetings, drafting new amendments to the bylaws, and promising her supporters that the rainbow would fall. Flyers appeared in mailboxes warning residents of dangerous precedent and outsiders flooding the community. Some neighbors, fearful of losing control of their property values, rallied behind her. Others, weary of her obsession, quietly distanced themselves. Meanwhile, the Rainbow House grew even more famous. Tour buses began to stop by, their guides pointing out the house that defied the HOA. Local businesses printed shirts with images of the rainbow facade, selling them to eager visitors. Even the mayor made a statement, calling the house a colorful addition to the city's identity. Karen's beige empire was cracking. For years, she had ruled Lakeshore Estates with unchallenged authority, her word treated as law. But now, her insistence on crushing the Rainbow House only exposed her as petty, controlling, and out of step with the times. In private, I wrestled with the chaos. I hadn't asked for fame. I hadn't asked to be the face of a movement. I only wanted a home that reflected joy instead of monotony. But each time I considered retreat, I remembered the threats, the fines, the bullying. Giving in would mean not only surrendering my home, but surrendering the right of everyone else who had ever been told they weren't allowed to be different. The war between Karen and me had escalated beyond the neighborhood. It was no longer about paint. It was about power, about freedom, about the cost of conformity. And though the court had yet to rule, one truth was undeniable. The Rainbow House had already won in spirit. But Karen wasn't finished. She had one last weapon left, one final scheme that would push the conflict to its breaking point. And when she unveiled it, the entire neighborhood would be forced to choose a side once and for all. If the courtroom had rattled Karen's authority, it only hardened her resolve. She was a woman who thrived on control, and losing it, even in perception, was something she could not accept. To her, the Rainbow House wasn't just a paint job, it was a threat to her entire reign. And when people like Karen feel cornered, they don't retreat quietly. They come back swinging. The escalation began subtly. New rules appeared in mailboxes, stamped with the HOA's seal and written in dense legal jargon. They outlined emergency amendments to the bylaws, rushed through in a closed-door board vote that no one had been invited to attend. Among them was a new clause. All houses must be painted in approved neutral colors only, explicitly banning multicolored or patterned designs. It was a transparent move, too late to apply retroactively, but designed to box me in for the future. If I lost the court case, the new rules would guarantee I could never fight back again. If I won, they would still have ammunition, too. Drag me into another round of legal battles. Karen wasn't playing for fairness. She was playing for exhaustion. But then came the real attack. One morning, I woke to find a construction crew parked outside the neighborhood entrance. Under Karen's direction, the HOA had hired workers to build a massive wall of hedges and fencing around the cul-de-sac. It was meant to block sight lines, to hide the Rainbow House from public view. If they couldn't control the paint itself, they would bury it behind greenery and wood, pretending it didn't exist. The community exploded. Some residents applauded the move, claiming it would restore peace. Others saw it for what it was: censorship, plain and simple. Fights broke out on sidewalks. Voices were raised at HOA meetings. The neighborhood, once proud of its order, was now a battlefield divided by color and ideology. And still, the crowds came. If anything, the attempted blockade only fueled more curiosity. Tourists leaned over the fences, kids climbed onto shoulders, and social media lit up with hashtags like Free the Rainbow and #HOAV's color. The more Karen tried to hide the house, the brighter it seemed to shine. Desperation set in. The HOA began issuing tickets to visitors, citing unauthorized gatherings. They called police nearly every day, hoping the chaos would scare people off. But law enforcement, caught in the spectacle, rarely did more than wave traffic along. Each failed attempt to control the situation only made Karen's authority look weaker. Inside her beige fortress, though, she plotted something far more dangerous. At the next emergency board meeting, she introduced a resolution no one had expected: foreclosure. She argued that my mounting fines and ongoing non-compliance gave the HOA grounds to seize my property. If she couldn't repaint the house, she would take it away entirely. The room went silent. Even her allies hesitated. To strip a man of his home over paint was extreme, even in the world of HOA politics. B. Karen pushed harder, framing it as necessary to protect the integrity of the community. Some nodded reluctantly, others looked away. And though the vote was close, the resolution passed. When I received the notice, my hands trembled. It was no longer an abstract threat. The HOA was moving to take my house, my sanctuary, my project, my defiance. Everything I had built was suddenly hanging by a thread. Yet even in that moment of fear, the rainbow stood tall. Strangers continued to send messages of support. Donations flowed in to fund my legal fight. Artists began painting murals of the Rainbow House in cities I'd never visited. The symbol had outgrown the structure itself. Karen didn't understand that. To her, the house was just wood and paint, something that could be crushed under paperwork and procedure. But to everyone else, it had become a story. A story about standing up to control, about daring to be different in a world that demanded sameness. The foreclosure battle became the climax of the war. The HOA filed their motion in court, confident they would win. My attorneys prepared their defense, bolstered by mountains of public support. Reporters swarmed outside the hearings, capturing every development as though it were the trial of the decade. The neighborhood couldn't bear the tension. Families who had once exchanged friendly waves now glared across driveways. Block parties were canceled. Children whispered about which parents were pro-rainbow and which were Team Beige. Lakeshore Estates was no longer a community. It was a divided battlefield. And at the center of it all was Karen, still convinced she could bend reality to her will. She had sacrificed her reputation, her friendships, and even the peace of the neighborhood for one single mission: to erase the rainbow. The court date for the foreclosure loomed closer, and with it, the final showdown. 1 odds. Outcome meant the loss of my home, my rebellion stripped away. The other meant Karen's empire of beige would crumble once and for all. As the day approached, I sat on my porch, staring at the painted stripes glowing under the evening sun. The rainbow seemed alive, each color pulsing with defiance. I knew, whatever happened, I had already won in spirit. But the battle wasn't over yet. The last fight was about to begin. The day of the foreclosure hearing dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself had chosen a neutral shade in honor of the HOA. But inside me, there was no gray. Only color. Only defiance. Only the knowledge that whatever happened in that courtroom would mark the end of a war that had consumed not just my life, but the entire neighborhood. The courthouse was packed. Reporters filled every bench, their cameras already rolling. Protesters lined the steps outside, holding rainbow flags and chanting so loudly that their voices echoed through the marble halls. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a spectacle. A trial watched by thousands across the country who saw the Rainbow House as a symbol of resistance. Karen arrived dressed in her usual beige armor, clutching her binder as though it could shield her from the tide of opposition. Her face was set in stone, eyes sharp, jaw clenched. She had staked everything on this moment. If she lost, her empire of control would collapse. If she won, she would take my home and prove that no rebellion could stand against her authority. The HOA's lawyers delivered their argument with cold precision. They spoke of fines, of non-compliance, of rules broken and order shattered. They painted me as reckless, defiant, unwilling to respect the community that had welcomed me. Their words dripped with disdain, crafted to portray the rainbow as a threat rather than a home. But then came my turn. My attorneys stood with quiet confidence, their defense sharpened not by money but by principle. They argued that the foreclosure was an abuse of power, a punishment so disproportionate that it revealed the HOA's true motives: control, not community. They reminded the court that the bylaws, as written, had not been violated. And they spoke of the thousands who had rallied, the support that had poured in, The undeniable truth that the Rainbow House had become more than paint. It had become a voice. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, his gavel silent as the arguments clashed. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then, finally, the decision came. The foreclosure was denied. The HOA had overstepped, the judge ruled. Their bylaws were too vague, their penalties excessive, their motives tainted by bias. The Rainbow House would stand, untouched by their threats. The fines were thrown out, the foreclosure dismissed, and the case closed with a single strike of the gavel. For a moment, silence filled the courtroom. Then, outside, the roar of the crowd exploded like thunder. Reporters rushed for the exits, protesters cheered, and strangers embraced in celebration. The Rainbow House had won. Karen sat frozen, her face drained of color, as though the world had finally painted her in shades she couldn't control. Her empire of beige, built on fear and obedience, had crumbled in a single ruling. She had lost not just the battle, but the war. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The Rainbow House became a landmark, its image splashed across magazines, news sites, and television screens. Tourists still came, but now the HOA had no power to stop them. Local artists painted murals inspired by its colors, and the city even recognized it as a symbol of community expression. As for Karen, her reign ended quietly. Under pressure from both neighbors and the public, she resigned from the HOA board. Some said she moved away, retreating to a different community where beige still reigned, supreme. Others claimed she stayed, but rarely left her house, the sight of the rainbow too painful a reminder of her defeat. The neighborhood, freed from her grip, began to breathe again. New rules,